Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this installment we're killing time as Shane Black reboots the Predator franchise. After a predator, played by Brian A. Prince, crashes on Earth, the creature is discovered by Quinn McKenna, played by Boyd Holbrook, and soon both Quinn and the predator are captured by Traeger, played by Sterling K. Brown, who has an interest in the aliens. Quinn managed to mail the predator's armor to his autistic son Rory, played by Jacob Tremblay, who activates the technology, sending a signal that brings an upgraded, even more dangerous predator to Earth. Quinn teams up with biologist Casey Brackett, played by Olivia Munn, and a group of misfit soldiers, including Trevante Rose Nebraska, Keegan-Michael Keyes Coyle, Thomas James Baxley, Alfie Allen's Lynch, and Augusto Aguilera's Nettles to stop the predators and rescue his son. The original 1987 Predator is a stone-cold action classic. Arnold Schwarzenegger leads his band of incredibly macho mercenaries for a rescue mission in the jungle that soon turns deadly when they realise they're being hunted by a vicious alien, one their firepower simply cannot overcome. It combines elements of the genre with sci-fi and horror, and it's directed by John McTiernan, who just a year later made another action classic in the form of Die Hard. And just like that movie, the suspense in Predator is very taut, but it's also combined with memorable characters and extremely quotable dialogue. It's largely off of the back of the success of the first movie that Predator exists as a franchise. There was, of course, a sequel a couple of years later, which I do have to admit I trashily enjoy. It's very, very over the top, but it's very fun in its own way. A lot of the Predator lore that we come to know now, most of that came from the sequel rather than the original. Nevertheless, that movie did underwhelm at the box office, so there was a long gap between movies. It was only in 2004 did the Predator come back to our screens in the Alien vs Predator franchise, and again in 2007, and let's just sweep those under the rug, shall we? Nevertheless, those paved the way for a solo revival, thanks to Robert Rodriguez, who produced Predators in 2010, starring Adrian Brody, which was essentially a dour remake of the first film. Enter Shane Black, who of course starred in the original 1987 film, but he's better known as a writer more than he is an actor, and you probably know his work, be it Lethal Weapon or The Long Kiss Goodnight, and he's more recently moved into directing, including the likes of Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, Iron Man 3 and The Nice Guys, and I like Black's work quite a bit. He has very quotable dialogue, and his writing is very, very smart, and he re-teams with Fred Dekker, who he co-wrote The Monster Squad with, and clearly they're trying to have a throwback vibe with this new version of the franchise, and if anyone could handle this series, surely it's someone who was there right from the very beginning. This must be the return of the Predator to its glory days. Or not. Right from the very outset, the Predator is beset by problems. It's not without its early promise, but even in the first acts of the film, it's a jumbled, cluttered mess that pretty much sets the stage for the rest of the movie to follow. And the first big problem from a script and story point of view is there's simply too much of it. There is simply too many storylines, too many characters. There are 3 storylines running in parallel in the early section of the movie. We have Quinn, who discovers the Predator, and then he meets up with his ragtag team that's eventually going to fight against them. We have Traeger, who's experimenting on the Predator. You can imagine these two working fairly well against each other, but then they're interrupted by the third storyline, focusing on Quinn's son, Rory, who intercepts the Predator's armor. And every time it cuts to this storyline, I was yanked out of the movie because it feels so wildly at odds with everything else around it. It feels like a totally different movie. And so that pretty much sums up the issue with the Predator that dogs it all the way through, is that it fails to set up even a consistent tone all the way through it. It feels like it's struggling to find its own identity or even know what it's trying to do. Is it trying to be a throwback action movie? Is it trying to be a self-aware send-up of its own franchise? Or is it trying to be a touching father-son storyline? It's trying to be all three and does precisely none of them. And it's so frustrating because it's clear that Black & Decker had a lot of promising ideas for the script because they pretty much threw in all of them. There are so many great potential ideas in this movie that are barely even in it, and you have to almost squint to see them at points because they so barely establish themselves, and then the movie will just simply discard them, or forget about them, or never mention them again, just as soon as they're introduced, and it's so disorganised on screen. At certain points, it almost seems like this movie was going to be a Predator-themed version of the Monster Squad, especially in a moment where Rory actually wears the Predator armour when he goes out to Halloween. The movie actually sets itself on that holiday, and you think to yourself, is this where the movie's going? Is it going to be Predators disguised as trick-or-treaters? Is that what they're going to do? Are they going to have the kids fight up against them? Because that would have been a unique twist on it, I guess. Instead, it's just sort of there, like a vestigial element of about 20 different drafts ago, and then it's quickly forgotten about. And I know that some of this has to do with the fact that they reshot a lot of this movie. This clearly shows a lot of production troubles, but my goodness, this is in a form that is borderline incoherent. And making it worse is the editing. The editing is so tight on this movie, and I don't mean that as a compliment. Look, I like a good pacey movie. I think we all do. At the same time, you need to let stuff breathe. You need, a certain amount of just space for everything to sort of establish itself. The Predator never does this. It's so moving at a constant clip that it just trips over itself constantly and never gives itself any room for the audience to settle. It's always rushing, and that's what it feels like, ultimately. It feels like a frenzied 107-minute rush. I spent most of this movie asking myself one question, namely, what the hell happened to Shane Black? The writing in this movie is well below par, especially by his standards. He's normally shown himself to be such a smart, subversive, and witty writer, and in this film, it's so anonymous a lot of the time. I had a hard time believing this was Black's work because it really seemed uncharacteristic. And I don't just mean because the plot is sloppy as hell, but also the fact that even his strengths as a writer seem to have totally forsaken him here. Normally, his sense of humour can shine through. Even that does not work here. It's a sign of a bad Shane Black movie when there's hardly any quotable lines in it. And yet, here we are. The jokes in this movie are catastrophically ill-judged at points. At best, they're cringeworthy. At worst, they could be considered straight up offensive. The only times when you can really identify it as a Shane Black movie is when it's taking a pop at its own franchise's expense. There's a joke in this movie about how Predator is a misnomer because really he's a sportsman, he's a hunter, but Predator sounds cooler, and if you thought that was clever, they'll repeat it 10 minutes later. But that joke hints at maybe a Gremlins 2 style version of this movie where it mercilessly sends itself up. And you know what? I would have kind of been on board with that because it would have been something different and it would have been very uniquely Shane Black, someone who walked into the Iron Man franchise and subverted expectations in a really playful way. Here, they're fleeting moments in otherwise a sea of grey, dull dreariness, and the film amplifies its problems by the constant in-jokes and references to the rest of the franchise. Not only do they have several disarming scenes in this movie, but they also work in the quotes from the first film, and that's always cringeworthy. Not either get to the chopper, but you're one ugly mofo. And it's just embarrassing, as it always is. Speaking of those, Jake Busey is in this movie, playing the son of the character that his father played in Predator 2. This is one of those things that they establish, and you think, oh, he's going to play a prominent role. That's kind of cute. But he acts nothing like Gary Busey. He's just a generic scientist character who then drops out of the movie. So why is he even there in the first place? Why even have the continuity connection if you don't actually bring it up or make it significant in any way? Even Black's ability for characterization seems to have gotten lost somewhere. Boyd Holbrook in the lead role is bland and unremarkable. He's totally generic as a ooh-rah soldier type, just grunting his way through with none of the charisma that he brought to Logan last year. He's not even an adequate replacement for Adrian Brody and Danny Glover, let alone Arnold Schwarzenegger. In fact, much of the time, Holbrook is actually shone off screen by many of his much brasher co-stars. I will say this about the ragtag band of soldiers. I really like the performers that they cast in them, and they do their best, and occasionally they are quite amusing. They're also quite obnoxious and irritating at certain other points, especially Keegan-Michael Key. The problem with those soldiers is from a writing point of view, when you're writing a group dynamic, they can't all be the wild card. Functionally, they're all the same character, with maybe the slightest of differences between them, and unfortunately, having 5 different characters that are all crazy is really, really grating after a certain point, especially because crazy is not a substitute for characterization. They give a little bit of fleshing out to these characters, but otherwise, they're pretty much interchangeable with each other, and they really don't stand out because of it. You can't have all the members doing this. They need to have distinct identities. That's what made the characters in the first movie so memorable, and it doesn't help that the film points this out, in fact, by saying they're like the first team, only stupider. Well, you said it, movie. Olivia Munn is blighted by the fact that she barely gets an introduction in this movie. The first time we see her character, she gets picked up by government agents while walking her dog. Who is this person? I don't know. Why is she being invited here? Well, as she mentions, she wrote a letter to the president when she was 6 about how she wanted to meet aliens if they ever found them. I think she's joking in that scene, but for all we know, she could be completely serious with that remark because we know that little about her and why she's there, which is a real problem when you're trying to build her up as a main character. Nevertheless, it looks like she's actually going to be the action hero of this movie. And you know what? I would have loved to have seen a movie where Olivia Munn was the main cast member. Instead, they immediately downplay her significance and pretty much relegate her to being exposition. The expository dialogue in this movie is some of the worst that I've seen in a very long time. And again, very uncharacteristic for Shane Black. Literally, characters like Olivia Munn will pick up something, look at it, and determine its entire history and the Predator's motivations just simply from looking at a prop, like they're psychic. Like, huge deductions all the way through this movie, and the only reason this is happening is because, the plot needs to be moved forward. We need to explain this to the audience, which brings us to Sterling K. Brown, who also suffers the wrath of the expository dialogue, and the film spends so much time hyping him up. Any time he enters into this movie, usually on a helicopter, is with the Predator theme blaring away in the background that lets you know this guy is significant, this guy means business, and he's usually got the most quotable lines, and he's coming out with a lot of attitude. Perhaps a little bit too much so, like Brown is trying a bit too hard to be the coolest character in the movie. And so they try to build up a sense of mystery with him about his motivations, much as in the same way that Carl Weathers Dylan was a bit sort of shadowy and you didn't know what he was up to. He's very much the analog to that character. He's meant to be the human antagonist. Unfortunately, at the end of the first act, after spending so much time with him, he gets pushed aside for much of the second act. In fact, he spends most of that going after the action, explaining things that we've already seen and that we already know about. But you think, okay, he comes back into the movie towards the end, and that's where he's going to get this real significant payoff. You're going to keep waiting for it. Trust me. He's a character that is puffed up as being majorly important, And then he really does so very little. He again seems like someone that should have been a major component of this movie that just feels like they've been left in from multiple rewrites and drafts. But perhaps the film's most egregious missteps are to do with the character of Rory. Now, I don't mean to put Jacob Tremblay down. I think he's a remarkable child actor, and I think his performance in this movie, on its own merit, is actually quite brilliant. The problem is the material he's given, which is awful, and it's nothing to do with him. I knew we were in for a bad time with this character when in his very first scene he resets not one, not two, but 3 different chess games all at the same time. It is utterly steeped in Hollywood cliches of gifted children and autism, and it felt like I was watching the movie Mercury Rising at points, to the point where Bruce Willis could almost leap into frame. And it really is so spectacularly ill-judged. It uses autism as a plot device, not just because it uses autism as a magic key like so many other movies of this type to decode hidden languages and other things like the Predator's technology, but also because it proves to be a crucial plot point through the movie. I see what they were trying to do. They did not pull this off in any way. Compounding this issue, the film also has a depiction of Tourette's in it, and this is really odd because Shane Black actually has Tourette's in real life. This is why he wrote that trait for Thomas Jane's character, and yet it doesn't feel like it's written particularly sensitively. It feels like it's there to add more cursing and as cheap punchlines all the way through the film. The only time when the film actually uses that intelligently is when one of his tics actually distracts the Predator momentarily, and not for an easy joke, which I just found really uncomfortable. I've been speaking about this movie for so long, and I've barely even talked about the Predators in it. We have both classic and new Coke flavours, but unfortunately, my question was, why do we even need 2 different Predators? You could easily rewrite this so that they're the same character. It just adds a bunch of convoluted wrinkles to a film that doesn't need any more of those, quite frankly. The only real difference between the 2 Predators, aside from the fact that the new one has its own armour and is much taller, is the fact that the classic Predator is actually a guy in a suit playing it, whereas the new version is a CGI character that looks so much worse, and functionally is pretty much identical. You don't really get any sort of increased threat from the new design, especially because the movie does not know how to use the Predator properly. The Predator should be using stealth, it should be using its invisibility to lurk in the trees and try to take advantage of people. It seldom does that because so often it's running around in full view. We see far too much of the Predator in this movie, often without its armour, so there's not even the mystique of that. It seems to have just assumed that, oh, because we've had so many movies with the Predator now, we'll just have them run around completely on show and just blasting around at everything. That's not how they should be acting, and as such, the movie builds no suspense or tension around their appearances. Of course, that's very hard when one of them is a CGI character, and it doesn't help that the CGI in this movie is really ropey, especially when it comes to the Predator dogs, which is again something that should be quite intense and suspenseful, and yet is immediately cutesified. But nevertheless, the problem is that the movie is so utterly lacking in any kind of horror. That's a key component to this series, and yet I think the Predator's very first introduction in this movie pretty much sums up the problem. The Predator's first big intro is a close-up of it being showered in blood, and that pretty much seems to sum up the approach to the production, in that, yeah, we'll have loads and loads of gore, and I will give it credit, there's some imaginative kills, but it's not scary. The action scenes are very clumsily photographed. You look at the scene where the Predator escapes from the lab, and it's just a jumbled mess of cuts. You can barely work out what's happening, and it doesn't seem very intimidating because of it. And much of the action is like this. It's either cut up too much, or it's shot in the dark so you can barely see it. As the film rushes towards its climax, it suddenly feels the need to revert to franchise formula, becoming a mini remake of Predator in the last 10 minutes, and so it starts whistling down the cast in very quick succession. As such, you really don't care about their fates. You don't care about their relationships in the same way you did for the characters in the original 1987 film. In one character's case, they're dispensed with in such arbitrary fashion, it's literally blink or you'll miss it. I barely even registered it happening on screen. It was that insulting. And the characters do really silly things just to get themselves bumped off. And then it goes into a final battle with the Predator, which is extremely underwhelming, especially considering that they built up this new version of the Predator as such a threat, and yet it's not even a patch on the finale between Arlie and the Predator in the first film. It feels like a very, very rushed rerun of it, and that's incredibly unfortunate. But if you thought that was a bad note to go out on, unfortunately it gets even worse, because the final scene of the movie is awful sequel bait. The Predator is a massive letdown that has obviously been blighted by major studio interference and massive reshoots that means that it's just a complete mess from start to finish. Even among the other solo Predator films, which aside from the first one are mostly a mixed bag, this is by far the least of any of them. I haven't seen those movies in quite a bit, but I'm pretty sure even Predators was better than this movie, and at least more cohesive as a whole. This is a movie that had all the ingredients to succeed, and yet it is a squandered opportunity, and as such, it pretty much just sits as the newest skull on my trophy shelf. The Predator is a huge disappointment and far less than the sum of its overstuffed parts. The film is disjointed and disorganised with so many characters and plots that it borders on incoherent, not helped by the constant rushed pace that removes virtually any breathing room. It seldom feels like a Shane Black movie, especially in the writing and particularly the dialogue, which is uncharacteristically awful and nearly entirely expository, and even the characters are underdeveloped sketches that are mostly an interchangeable bunch of crazies. If it wasn't for the occasional self-aware digs at the franchise, you'd struggle to identify who even made it. And that really is the worst thing about it, just how generic and forgettable it is, looking like any other stale, CGI-heavy franchise revival with poorly staged action sequences and buckets of gore instead of genuine tension or horror. The gradual suspense of the original is not only greatly missed, but this may be the worst solo entry to date. If you like this review, then you can hunt down my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.